This is Product Management. Welcome. We're here to learn from brilliant minds across numerous disciplines that fuel the modern product manager. Let's take a deep dive into user experience, innovation, design, development, metrics, and more. Do you want more product management tactics and research? Subscribe at thisisproductmanagement.com to receive the latest updates from this podcast.
Hey, I'm your host, Mike Fishbein. This is Product Management, a podcast produced by Alpha. Welcome back. On this episode, I'll be speaking with the legendary entrepreneur and author of the Startup Owner's Manual, Bob Dorf. He'll tear apart many of the excuses organizations make for not adopting lean methodologies and make the case for leadership and product managers to embrace a culture of learning and experimentation.
I've been a startup guy since the age of 22, which was don't tell anybody, but 45 years ago when I quit a really great job to start my first business. And about 7 years ago, a client of my seventh startup, a guy named Steve Blank, who had already dedicated a decade of his life to thinking through what today is known as the lean startup methodology, asked me if I'd do him a favor and co-author a new book with him. He had been working on the methodology literally for a decade. It needed a greater sort of process and granularity to it, much like a book I had written about CRM about a decade before. And most of my startups have been in the marketing services area, which in many ways is what lean is all about, because if you don't get customers for your business, the greatest product or idea in the world isn't much of a success. Well, it's really what we're here about. No bullshit lean is product management.
Bob's topic should give you a fairly good idea about where this episode is heading. But first, why is he passionate about the lean movement as it relates to startups and large corporations?
Well, I think it really starts with the founding principle of lean that is so different from product management in major enterprises, and that is find and almost celebrate the failures, the mistakes in evolving your product or service idea. Typically in big corporations, you bury the mistakes, you run from them, and you try very hard not to make them because big companies are all about execution. Lean in the startup world, where the risk tolerance is infinitely higher, is all about getting it right and taking the risks and saying, oh, that'll never work, let's try this, and doing that over and over again till you get the right mix of value proposition, customer targeting, marketing, distribution to create a business that starts to thrive and grow. And it leads in some ways to many of the challenges of applying lean in the big enterprise world.
It sounds like lean is a movement that startups embrace, but that goes against everything large companies stand for. Learning instead of execution? Why should a big company care about that?
I think the challenge of virtually every enterprise, in this decade is growth. Corporate growth is minimal. Much of it is sort of manufactured through either cost cutting or mergers and acquisitions. And to develop the ability to stimulate real organic growth, corporations have to sort of step up their game in terms of risk tolerance and trial and error kind of approaches to things, as opposed to simply executing a plan based on last year's successes and failures. And the way we think about it is that big corporations operate on execution mode. They have history, they have customers, they have losses and victories, and when they're writing their 2017 plan, they can base it on facts and experience of 2016, which competitors beat them, which ones they beat, which customers they lost, and why. A startup has none of that history, and by definition, a startup has no customers, no history, no product. Product hasn't been built yet. And so startups begin their life in search mode as opposed to execute mode, searching for that combination of elements that make a successful business. And if a corporation is going to strive for organic growth through new divisions, new geographies, new customers, new products, it has to be comfortable enough and courageous, you might say, enough to adopt the trial and error method and to operate in that search mode, which most big companies don't like. They much prefer execute, where they can measure performance against revenue number, customer targets, attrition targets, marketing achievements, things like that, and where you can put it all on a spreadsheet. In the early days in the startup world, the spreadsheets don't really exist because there isn't enough longitude or history to really base anything on, and you have to go out and sort of have the experiences. And so when big companies do this successfully, they sort of isolate the lean team from the typical volumes of rule books that big companies have and give the team permission to fail. Hopefully they're failing up by saying, that didn't work, let's try this, and sooner or later this does work, whether it's product features or marketing messages or distribution channels or each of the sort of 9 core elements of any successful business. And it gives the corporation an opportunity to grow organically rather than through acquisition or cost cutting, which are the two sort of favorite tricks, if you will, of big corporations driving for growth.
Today, many companies struggle to achieve organic growth, Bob says. But such an objective can only be achieved by essentially learning how to learn. What are some of the bullshit excuses stakeholders make to prevent this shift in mindset and practice?
Well, I think the biggest excuse is, we do everything by the book, we don't fail, and why would we take on that risk for some peanut of a business relevant to our, compared to our enterprise or division or product line? But from that peanut grows a peanut farm, and that's really what the corporation needs to accept and strive for. I was with one major corporation that deserves to remain nameless, where the teams were encouraged, innovate all you want, just don't lose any money on anything, and finish in 90 days, right? And it's sort of like if you told, Renoir, create a masterpiece, you've got 90 days, it's done when it's done. It's not done when the clock says it's done, which again is sort of antithetical to typical sort of corporate modus operandi. The other issue you have in big corporations, and we've seen this at some of the biggest in the land, is nobody in the corporation, not nobody, but very few people in the corporation are willing to take the career risk of jumping into some new internal startup team that might fail. At one huge software company, we did a workshop talking about how they could apply this to develop new products more quickly and with more agility. And half of the questions from the audience were, well, who's going to cover my behind if this doesn't work? And, I have to give up my nice window cubicle to go move into a basement somewhere and do this? Why exactly would I want to do this, and what's the reward? If you're the founder of a startup, the reward for a successful startup founder is obvious, wealth and fame and success and, opportunity to do more startups after that. Big corporations can't award equity in divisions that are part of the company. They can't violate the corporate compensation guidelines and stock option guidelines and things like that. So they can't provide the same kinds of compelling rewards. And so very often, when a corporation goes to innovate, they pick up the people to work on the team who are between jobs or maybe not performing as well as they would hoped, and hope that this sort of band of B-team players is going to suddenly magically have courage and intuition and boldness and innovation and risk tolerance and do something really great. One team I was with in a pharma company, we had people from all the wrong departments. We had regulatory people, we had legal people, nobody from sales or marketing, nobody who had really ever dealt with a customer face to face, working on customer discovery and understanding what customers were looking for in this new product line. And you could tell when you met the team that this was the B team. They may have been very qualified HR people or compliance people or whatever their day job was. But when you ask them to shed that sort of safety net and go out clearly on a limb, as you do in any type of lean innovation program, you wound up with a camel. A camel is a horse designed by a committee. And so you say, well, gee, I allocated the resources. I had 6 people on the team. They worked, for 2 months on this, and nothing happened. This lean thing isn't very good for us. And it's really too often a consequence of not having the courage or the understanding to do it right from the beginning. The other issue, which I've seen several times, is call it magical corner windowed office, where somebody with a window corner office says, okay, lean team, do this. And they prescribe the product and the features and the go-to-market strategy. Okay, go make it work. You've got 8 weeks. And nobody wants to go tell that big shot in the corner office that, well, we tested the product features with customers and they don't really want your prescription. They want a different prescription. Easier to just do it despite the lack of customer enthusiasm. And so it becomes a really self-defeating process. And I've seen that more times than I want to remember, where you can literally tell almost on day 1 or day 2 that wrong team, too many sort of guidelines and constraints put on their activity for them to ever have a chance to build something, important for the corporation.
According to Bob, the 2 greatest challenges for adopting lean within a large organization is a fear of risk and the inability to incentivize employees to participate in entrepreneurial efforts. Both are compounded by executives who prescribe products and features and who seem to be immune to customer feedback. So this seems like a hopeless predicament. Why does Bob even bother doing workshops then?
It's all about empowerment and permission to break rules. And the way I think of it is you almost have to put your lean team in a bubble and protect them from the 4 feet of regulations and policies and procedures. Give them permission to not put the company at risk, but to violate some of those rules. For example, in a OTC pharma company I was working with, we got an email from legal saying, you can't go out and talk to customers. It's a HIPAA violation because you're asking people to describe their health to you. We said, well, guys, then we ought to just tear up our contract, shake your hand, thank you, leave you some books on the table, and call it a day. And the conversation went a little further than that because the empowered, driven CEO said, I don't want to hear that. How do we solve this? And we said, well, how about if we never ask the customer his or her last name? And all we have is Michael, good-looking guy, black beard, black shirt, said his knee hurt all the time and, gave us all kinds of very personal information with no attribution to a human being. No violation of HIPAA, no violation of the 3 corporate rule books on how you interact with customers, and sort of, again, permission to break or recreate the rules and work around the rules, something that you would rarely do in a typical, particularly in a highly regulated industry like pharmaceuticals. The other key ingredient that's almost a showstopper is the lean team has to have a passionate, courageous champion. Somebody who says, okay, my job is to develop a new product in the paper area, paper manufacturing area, and the measure of my success is whether we come out at the end of this exercise with a viable new business opportunity for the corporation. And that person has to say, I don't care about the risk. My boss or board or CEO told me to get this done. Get out of my way. Lawyer, go away. Tell me that I'm not violating any laws and let me run with this, because without the customer interaction or without the sort of marketing testing or whatever, I'm never going to know if I have a success or not. And I told the CEO I was going to give this everything I could give it to build him or her a successful new business unit. So in most cases, that's really the critical ingredient, whether that person is the leader of the team or the division head or chief marketing officer or best the CEO, that they have given somebody a mandate to not necessarily to succeed, but to leave no stone unturned in testing and iterating and striving to build a new business. Now, the other thing that big corporations hate is the failure rate of lean enterprises. Depending on how you look at the statistics, it's either 96% of these initiatives, fail in a pile of blood and guts and perspiration. The other is for every 1,000 attempts, 2 become great, repeatable, scalable, profitable businesses. Either way, those are lousy odds and not the kind of odds that corporations are used to. When we were dealing with one company, they wanted to launch a series of lean initiatives, and we said, well, you've got to do at least 8, better 10 or 12, if you want to have hope that there's going to be a winner somewhere in this race. And they scaled it back to 5 and then to 3. And there may have been one winner in there, but it didn't have the chance of, optimum success. And so in a sense, you put the sponsor, the senior executive, in the difficult position of saying to his or her board or boss, well, we're going to go do 9 things, and I'm pretty sure 8 of them are going to fail. On the other hand, one of them could be a $100 million business in a couple of years, and we think that more than buries, the failures. Nobody asks Kleiner Perkins, arguably the greatest VCs in all the land, nobody asks them about the 40 companies they invested in, fund number 9 that failed and just collapsed and went out of business or got sold for piece parts, because Google was in fund 9 at 9,000 to 1 return. And that's the thought process that a corporation has to apply to sort of give itself the courage and the resource allocation to really do an honest job of no bullshit lean in product management.
To Bob's dismay, many companies that claim to buy into the lean mindset still consistently hamstring efforts. It seems like giant leaps forward will need to be instigated by corporate leaders before individual product teams and managers can find success. How does he go about convincing the C-suite to change the processes that have been in place for decades?
I think they have to see real results in analogous industries. Arguably one of the very best companies that's migrated, large companies that's migrated its product management almost entirely to lean is Intuit, where they have had victory after victory on top of lots of failures and launched several, 9-figure products using this lean approach of, force the failures, find the weaknesses, fix them, replace them, and then go try again. And so if I were talking to a CEO in the software business, I'd probably talk a lot about the Intuit experience, which has been written about extensively in, quality publications that would give the CEO some comfort. There are, a few food companies that have done the same. There are quite a few companies that have done it, but finding a company in a sort of analogous or metaphorical industry is probably one of the critical steps in convincing the CEO or the board. Another is having a high-performing senior executive willing to lead the charge. somebody's got to say, okay, I'm going to put my career at risk because I believe in this. I understand it. I am eager to make it work because I think our product management is stagnant and we're getting modest organic growth and we need something disruptive. And I would like the sort of capstone of my career to date in this company to be, the guy or gal who figured this out and brought the next big piece of organic growth to our company.
Once the C-suite determines that they're going to shift the organization to a lean framework, what are some of the necessary steps they must take? How do they solve the challenges mentioned earlier of de-risking entrepreneurship and incentivizing learning?
At GE, we were involved in recruiting the initial customer development team members. And I remember one interview we had with a fellow who was between jobs and had been at another big industrial corporation. And, about halfway through the interview, said, okay, so I get it. It's all the risk of a startup with GE salary, bonus, and benefits. In other words, no upside, so to speak, other than you get to keep your job if this thing is successful and maybe we'll smile at you. But there are two huge benefits that we talked to him about. First was you're going to have exposure to the top management of this company at a much higher frequency than you would ever have as a senior manager in any division in the company. You're going to see them fairly regularly because they're paying attention to the progress of this expensive, disruptive, courageous process. And number two, your reward comes not in investment capital, but in career capital. So at GE, for example, where they have actually now done some of this, several of the members of that first founding team at a division called Dorf are now running innovation projects themselves because, Jeff Immelt knows that the sort of organic growth is slow and he needs to find new disruptive technologies, new innovations to bring to the market to get real growth other than growth through acquisition. So that can be a pretty wonderful reward, even though it's not, a pound of stock options or, you own 6% of a company now worth $100 million. Good for you. Go buy your yacht and, hop on it for a couple of years. And sometimes you get wonderful surprises. We had a guy named Harold who was a manufacturing engineer for Merck in Memphis, Tennessee. And Harold said, I want to do this. I want to do this. Can I please be on that team? And all of a sudden, Harold was presenting to the CEO. He was driving a team doing really wonderful, insightful work that you wouldn't normally expect of a career manufacturing engineer, even though he was very capable and very bright and accomplished. And as it turned out, in that process, he did the corporation a big favor, which was, we think we have learned enough to know that this is not a good business opportunity for us. As opposed to the more typical, well, I'm supposed to do this, so I'm going to do it, so now it's time to build the factory or buy, $1 million worth of parts to assemble because that's what the next page in the playbook says. And I don't want to tell anybody else that maybe the baby is really ugly and maybe this really isn't a business. And so you can score as many points, so to speak, with senior management by saying, we have tried these 8 sort of bites at the apple and none of them are very tasty or tasty enough for our company to really pursue. So we recommend, shooting it in the back and trying again in a totally different area. It's a very courageous thing to do, but it's, obviously better to bring the corporation $100 million new line of business, but saving it, reputation risk, financial risk, and a whole lot of resource and time risk, in the sort of lean world is much more acceptable than it is in the big corporate world. But an enlightened CEO should say to Harold, as she did, thank you. great job. I think you did turn over every rock and try every angle on this business opportunity. And I agree with you. Don't see another way to make this into a business that would be valuable for us for the long term.
Large companies that want to adopt Lean can't offer the same incentives that an entrepreneur has when starting a business, but they can offer similar upside in the form of career opportunities and exposure to the C-suite. Further, they must encourage not only successful innovation, but also the elimination of wasteful initiatives that have been invalidated via Lean methodologies. How does this type of thinking spread throughout the company and begin impacting every single decision employees make?
I think they have to start by educating the people who are going to make the decision. My co-author, Steve Blank, wrote a beautiful piece in the Harvard Business Review, how the Lean startup changes everything. And it was more for corporations, because startup people don't typically read the Harvard Business Review. It takes too long, it's too sort of ponderous and so forth. But senior corporate executives do. So get some copies of that circulated, maybe highlight or summarize it rather than give them the 10-page article to read. Find case histories, as I was saying earlier, of companies in the similar or related industries that have used it effectively, and start to build the case for why the corporation should consider it. And then start small. Start with one or two experiments with a smaller team where people, as in many of the situations I've been involved in, you get a commitment of 20 hours a week from a half a dozen people rather than three full-time people, so that you're not, it's keep a good eye on your day job, but we need you, 2-3 days a week driving this new disruptive innovation, process forward. And for some people, you mean I got more work, but I get to do this bold, crazy, different, out-of-the-box kind of stuff? Thank you. I can't wait. It's like a bonus vacation for me. And I don't mind putting in the nights and weekends to do it. And hopefully it, pays off for me in terms of recognition, career growth, and so on. But assigning people to the task as opposed to sort of encouraging people to opt in is one of the mistakes corporations make all the time.
Before we dive into the benchmark, I put Bob on the spot. What's the single most critical element of putting aside the excuses and getting started with Lean?
Well, I think probably the most important thing to think about is how, our economy's not great. It's not horrible, but, honest corporate growth opportunities are very hard for product managers to come by. And if they want to achieve something substantial, something dramatic in their career, in that slot, in that, product management group, in that big company, they should at least give it a shot, give it a crusade to try to sell an initial project team or whatever. And the learning is always astounding, and the results are sometimes astounding. And it also, I think, gives that product manager something really different and potentially very important on his or her resume. That I have skills in this area, I have experience. No, we didn't develop a $100 million line of business, but we learned the process and the methodology and understand how to apply it in finding growth opportunities inside big corporations. So if they're thinking about moving on at some point, that can be a very powerful sort of resume builder, with or without that, monstrous success.
Embracing Lean methodologies is a lofty objective and one that takes putting aside quite a bit of BS in order to accomplish. Next up is the benchmark. Let's see how Bob reflects on the next series of questions we ask all interviewees to ask themselves.
How do I eat my own dog food? Well, The first time I ate my own dog food was about 10 years before Steve Blank wrote the first word about lean. This was in 1993. A guy named Don Peppers and I had an idea that there was a business opportunity in this newfangled thing called CRM. Today, everybody knows CRM, customer relationship management, individual databases on each of your customers and optimizing your business with them based on what you know about them individually. So Don and I said, well, how do we figure out if this is a business or not? And I said, well, why don't we do this? We'll each put $5,000 in a hat. We'll buy a bunch of airplane tickets. We'll go make 10 or 12 sales calls. If we get one or two consulting projects out of it to help companies explore how they can use CRM, we'll do the work, we'll split up the money, and we'll call it a day. If we get 3 or 4 customers, we'll take all the money, do all the work, and we'll put all the money in a big hat, and we'll start a business. The business we started July 1993. 7 years later, we had 450 employees all over the world. We had $50 million in revenue, and we were working for a who's who of major corporations, helping them install, deploy CRM systems to grow their businesses one customer at a time. A company originally called Marketing One-to-One, eventually renamed Peppers and Rogers Group in honor of the Don and his co-author of his first of a bunch of books, one of which I wrote with him. How do I get out of the office? There is no substitute, right? The only definition of success of a business or of potential success for a business is customers, right? The greatest ideas in the world don't become companies without customers giving that business money. Great feedback is just wonderful, but money is the proof. And so one of the things we stress in all of our work is that this is not something you assign to market research or to junior people. The CEO or the group leader of the lean team has to sit face to face across from customers. Are they being polite with their answers, or are they really excited, or they really hate your idea? You need to get honest, real feedback long before you start asking people for money, because the most successful businesses, A, solve serious, painful, frequent, expensive problems that recur again and again and again, because that's what businesses spend money to solve, to fix problems. And the only way to find out the severity of the problem is not to go and sell your solution and see if anybody's going to buy it, but to understand where that problem is in their sort of hierarchy of needs. If you're not solving one of the 5 problems or 3 problems that keeps them up at night or has them living in fear of getting fired or demoted or getting no budget to grow their unit, if you're not delivering a solution like that, at the end of the day, when you come back to ask for money, you're going to be very, very sadly disappointed. And at the point at which you ask for money, you've now spent a whole bunch of human and financial resources to get the product to the point where you can actually say, here, buy this from me. What am I reading right now? Actually, mostly I'm reading junk fiction because I've been overwhelmed. There's so many new books about innovation and startups that it's just become sort of a blur, and especially since I live with it almost every single day. So I'm, reading Daniel Silva and Stephen Baldacci and stuff to just clear my head a little bit. And I'm sure, in the next few weeks, another hot business book will come out that's a must read. But the other thing that doesn't sound on the face of it like an innovation book is a simple biography, the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs. And anybody listening to this podcast who hasn't read it should get a copy, curl up in their favorite chair for a long weekend. It's a serious slog. But what it teaches you about courage in a big enterprise and thinking about what really matters to customers and the anecdotes and the war stories, I think are, it could have, should have been a textbook. It's so rich in sort of information and instruction on how to think as an innovator, as certainly Steve Jobs among, the most brilliant innovators in our history. A recurring product management nightmare I have is getting only negative feedback where there's no glimmer of an idea. Lots of times good ideas are born by cutting old ideas in half or adding something to it or changing the way you sell it, going from paid to freemium or from buy it to lease it, as in, SaaS software. But when you go out, and we encourage serious lean product managers to talk to, not necessarily entirely themselves, talk to 50 customers face to face before you start talking to them about the product itself. Talk about the problem, how they solve it now, what they wish for in a solution. And when you go out on a journey like that and you find sort of no hope for your idea, that to me is the greatest nightmare. If you don't find a thread you can follow to build on and to sort of rebuild your idea around that sort of glimmer of light in this big dark tunnel, that's probably my biggest nightmare, and I have slept through it. I've lived through it, more than a few times.
Listeners can find out more about Bob at bobdorf.nyc. If you want to learn more about innovation at large companies, we've interviewed leaders from MasterCard, Ford, Marriott, BBVA, and Barclays for a new show called The Innovation Benchmark. Check it out at theinnovationbenchmark.com. And that's our show. Until next time, this is Mike Fishbein from Alpha.
Do you want more product management tactics and research? Subscribe at thisisproductmanagement.com to receive the latest updates from this podcast.